Hi, everyone. So this is going to be my Unit 22 summary. So this unit is all about how we can try to model what governments do from an economic perspective. And so what I'm going to do in this video is to start with, define what we mean by a government, talk about what things a government might want to do and how it might achieve those things. And then after that, I'll introduce the different models that we have in this unit to represent how governments make decisions and how different types of governments make decisions, from a sort of monopolist government, like a dictatorship, to one with a governing elite, to then one where we have like ideal democracy. And at the end, we'll look at maybe some of the reasons why governments struggle or governments fail to kind of implement the policies that they want. So to begin with, the sort of definition stuff. So what do we mean by government? We can define it as the only body in a geographical territory that can legitimately use force and the threat of force on citizens of that nation. That sounds like really quite malicious or like quite nasty, but in essence, it means that what the government's able to do is to get people to do things. It can kind of force people to do things by putting in place laws and punishments for people who break those laws, so that people do and follow certain rules. Right? That's what we mean by a government, the body that can put that in place. Also would say that a government has an obligation to its citizens, and that obligation, now this is a bit kind of broad, but it's based on civil rights, so that everyone should have, certain freedoms, I suppose, or certain rights that can't be violated, and human rights. And I suppose that's a really, really similar thing. So the government has the power to coerce, the power to kind of force people to do things, but it also has an obligation to civil and human rights. So what might a government be aiming to do? Well, that could be a whole sweep of things, but we can imagine that the two objectives that a government has: one, ensure that the mutual gains possible through economic interactions are as large as possible and fully realized. So we know that if economic agents interact with each other, there'll be an outcome. Different economic agents will get different shares of the pie, and the government's role is to try and make sure that the pie is as large as possible, and it's fully realized, so we get as large a pie as possible, but that the share of the pie that different people get is shared out, is distributed in a fair manner. So one of the things that a government has to do or can do is step in to try and deal with instances of market failure or unfairness. And just some quick examples of how it might do that: competition policies, if we have a market failure of there being a monopolist; environmental policies, if we have externalities as a result of, say, some production or consumption; subsidies to try and encourage research and development, innovation, that's going to mean in future we have a larger pie; policies to establish the expectation that aggregate demand will be relatively stable, right? So that aggregate demand across the whole economy is going to be stable. Why would we want that? So that firms have an incentive to actually invest, because they're expecting, more and more demand in future. Public provision of certain goods, so healthcare is an example. Similarly, instead of providing the healthcare, they could insist on there being insurance for everyone. To provide information, so one of the reasons we know that there are market failures is as a result of asymmetric information. And so the government can step in to try and help people make better decisions by improving the information they have. Then we've got central bank. So this is interesting because we see government, we kind of think of like, a parliament, something like that. But we could also have central bank as part of that, even though they are independent. And those policies are designed, central bank's policies are designed to try and strike a balance between risk taking that we want commercial and investment banks to do, but not so much risk that it causes a problem across the whole financial system. Minimum wage laws, another thing to try and protect maybe workers. So those are some of the policies. What are the tools government have? Well, very broadly, incentive systems. So using taxes in particular ways or subsidies in particular ways might encourage people to act in a particular way. And so you can not force people, but just try and give them a bit of a reason to do what you think will be beneficial. So regulation, that is very much, I suppose, trying to force people to do a particular thing, right? So regulation, right, like regulating the degree of competition, making it compulsory to participate in, say, medical insurance, just like really stepping in and forcing people, in a sense, to do what you want them or need them to do. Then we've got persuasion or information. So again, that's just kind of providing information. You'll see this on government websites, government advertising campaigns. Think about smoking, brilliant example there. Then public provision. So just before I do that, I'm going to take a quick pause. All right, sorry about that. So I think the last government tool, public provision. So where the government actively steps in to try and provide a particular service or good, I suppose. So just to explain one important thing here, in-kind provision or through monetary transfers. So as in-kind provision, meaning the government actually sets up the system, provide that good or service directly to the people, or through monetary transfers, as in the government provides people with actually the finances, the money to buy or purchase that service. So, education, we typically think of in most countries as in-kind provision. It's the government that actually sets up the schools, hires the teachers, whereas something like legal representation, there are lawyers, there is a court system, and if someone lacks the funds to be able to afford representation, the government can actually provide them the money to pay. So with this kind of large scope that government has, creates a bit of a problem here. So government can become a part of the problem. We have this dilemma, right? If the government wants to accomplish these kind of broad, big policies, or implement these policies to achieve certain goals, they need to have quite big powers, right? Extraordinary powers, the power to kind of coerce the citizens. But giving the government those powers means potential problems, potentially dangerous, because sometimes governments will use those powers in really negative ways in terms of what happens to the citizens. So that's a real big dilemma around government. So how can we try and constrain government so this doesn't become a problem, or that we don't run into this problem of governments becoming dangerous? Well, a couple of, I was going to say simple, not necessarily simple ways, but a couple of kind of ideas of how that can be done. One, democratic elections. If every citizen gets to vote for who that government's going to be, that puts a constraint on the power of the government, right? The fact that they have to do things that the electorate want them to do. They can't abuse their power and do what the government just wants, because they're going to face an election. And if they haven't done things that people like, then they'll be kicked out. And then we also have institutional checks and balances. So actually that there is, say, a constitution or some sort of legal framework that means governments can and cannot do certain things. So those are two kind of good ways of constraining the power of government, so that we don't get into this problematic situation where government does things that are really negative for its citizens. So I think this is the final thing before we get into the models, and it's just about this idea of, well, there's a few things here. So before I go into this, let me pause to make sure I explain it properly. Yeah, so I think it's just to come back, this kind of final bit here is just drawing a bit of a link between, and a link we're going to see quite a bit later on, between kind of how we can think about how governments function versus how markets function. And that even if we have a potential market failure or government failure, there is a kind of a limitation to how bad that could be. So for example, and this is because of, in a market case, because of economic accountability, and in the government case, because of political accountability, that there are actually sort of mechanisms holding firms to account in a market and government to account in kind of a political market, I suppose. So here we kind of imagine we've got a natural monopoly, and we could have a firm operating that natural monopoly. And although that's a market failure, there is a kind of limitation to it, because the monopoly, although they're going to charge more than the marginal cost to them, so the firm who is the monopolist, they'll charge more than the marginal cost to them. They will be constrained. They can't just charge whatever they want, because they do have to still cater to the demand curve of the consumers. So that does still put a constraint on them. If the government decided that they wanted to run this natural monopoly themselves, then again, we could potentially have a market failure there, because I say market failure, a government failure, because if the government's running this natural monopoly, then maybe they wouldn't have an incentive to minimize cost, right? And so then the consumers would actually have to pay a price, even though that price is equal to the marginal cost. The marginal cost is actually much higher than it would be if we had a firm in charge of this natural monopoly. So that's just a nice example of how, there are accountabilities that stop governments from being able, or stop, I misspoke. There are accountabilities that stop monopolies from kind of abusing their power, and there are accountabilities that stop governments who are running a natural monopoly from abusing their power. In the government case, what stops them from abusing their power? That they're going to have to face an election. And so if they've done really badly in running this natural monopoly, that might mean that they lose power when they face that election. Okay, so those are the kind of introductory ideas. What I'm going to do now for most, I think, of the rest of this video is look at the different models that the unit goes through for different types of political systems. I'm going to start with government as a monopolist, which is probably a nice way of saying a dictatorship, and I'll talk about that after a quick break. Okay, so the first model that we look at is how we could think about what a government as monopolist or as a dictatorship, how they will operate and how they will make their decision. And we keep this kind of really simple in that we basically just think about the decision they're making is about how much tax that they're going to charge their citizens. And the dictator faces this trade-off between the amount of tax that they're going to charge and how long they'll actually be able to stay in power, or how long they expect to stay in power. So I talked about tax, but really the reason that they're going to charge tax is because the dictator wants to try to maximize the potential political rent, or the political rent that they can achieve from being in power. So what do we mean by political rent in the model? Well, let's have a look at this diagram here, and let's focus on the blue shaded area to begin with. So if the dictator decides that what they're going to do is actually have total tax revenue per year of T2, when the cost to provide public services per year is C, then that gap there between T2 and C, so T2 minus C, that represents the political rent to the dictator, right? And it actually is a kind of financial value, that the difference between how much they're actually charging the citizens in terms of the tax they're collecting and how much it costs to then run all the public services, that gap all goes to the dictator. Now, if the dictator decides to choose T2, this high level of tax, then, and we haven't got this fully yet, this duration curve we'll see in a second, but then that's going to mean that they can only expect to stay in power for D2 years, right? And as a result, this blue area here will represent the total amount of political rent they're going to collect, right? If we do T2 minus C, that gives us the height of the rectangle, multiplied by D2, that gives us the base. And so that's going to give us the total financial value of that political rent. Whereas if the dictator decides to charge T1, a lower level of tax, then the citizens are less annoyed, and so will kind of go longer without resisting and revolting and overthrowing the dictator. And so we see the duration that they're in office is longer, it's D1, but that T1 minus C, that political rent per year, is smaller. And so the total political rent they'll get if they decide to choose T1 is the kind of reddy orange shaded area, right? So this is a nice kind of setup. And well, let's think, well, what does a dictator want to do? How are they going to decide where to make their choice? Well, they're obviously going to want to maximize the political rent that they could achieve. So that's where we now need to introduce, I would say, the complete model here, which is where we have the thing that constrains the dictator, which is this red line, the duration curve. And so what this shows us is the combination of tax revenues and the expected duration of that dictator's time in office, right? So high tax revenues correspond to a short amount of time in office, low tax revenues to a longer time in office. And we see this very important point here where the duration curve hits the cost. This shows us the maximum possible duration. So why is that the maximum possible? Well, maximum kind of sensible or like rational possible time. Why is that? Because if the dictator has chosen this point here on the duration curve, they're collecting tax revenue just equal to the cost of public service, which means they're actually not getting any political rent whatsoever. And so that would be the kind of, you wouldn't go below this, because if you go below this, then what does that mean? It means that actually the dictator is having to spend some of their own money to fund public services, which, I mean, maybe they would do. It wouldn't seem to be a very rational thing to do. So that point there is what gives us the maximum possible. So how does the dictator decide what level of tax to set? Well, we've seen this type of problem lots and lots before. We've got the constraint, right, which is our duration curve, which we could, of course, think about a marginal rate of transformation there, right? The slope of this would give us the marginal rate of transformation. And then we've got a second set of curves, right? These ISO rent curves. So what are they? Well, ISO means kind of the same. So these are combinations of a duration of time in office and a value of tax revenue per year that would deliver a constant level of political rent. So for the dictator's perspective, they want to be on the highest possible ISO rent curve, right? And we can see from this diagram, that's going to be at point B, because they can only choose from different combinations along the duration curve. So they're going to choose the combination along here, which gets them to the highest possible ISO rent curve, which is the one that the duration curve is a tangent to. And that's why this dictator will choose point B. And so T star here will be the tax revenue that they charge. D star here will be the duration that they'll be in office. And then this rectangle that's traced out here, T star minus C, the height of the rectangle, multiplied by D star, that area there gives the total political rent that they would expect to get from making this decision. So that's a nice way of modeling how a dictator might decide to, say, set tax revenue, but obviously like quite a simplistic picture of how government's running. All they're doing is just deciding how much tax to collect. Okay, so that's kind of our first model, the model of dictator. Okay, and before I go into this kind of next step model, I'm just going to again take a quick pause. Okay, so what we are going to imagine now is that we've kind of moved from a situation where there is a dictator and there's no other alternative, to now where we have a governing elite, right? A set of people who are in charge of all the decisions that are being made in the country, and in particular who are deciding on the level of tax revenue. And by introducing this governing elite and then the possibility of other governing elites, other people who could take over, and then like how is that going to be achieved? Through an election. We are going to change then the decision that is being faced by the governing elite. And so what does that mean in terms of our diagram here? Well, it's still pretty much all the same, right? That we've got our duration curve, which tells us all of the feasible combinations of tax revenue and the time in power, or the expected time in power for this governing elite. And what they want to do again is choose a point along that feasible frontier, along the duration curve that gets them to the highest possible ISO rent curve, so maximizing the political rent that can be achieved. But if there's now the possibility of other governing elites, that raises the possibility of the governing elite being kicked out in the next election. And how do we imagine that has an impact on our diagram here? Well, we imagine it makes the duration curve a little bit shallower, right? So a little bit shallower, and let's think about what does that mean? Well, it means for any given value of a tax revenue per year, that the duration that that governing elite could expect to stay in power is shorter, right? So if we choose, I need to just zoom in a little bit. I think that says TN, right? Yeah. So if we choose TN, then on the old duration curve, where there's very little competition, maybe we're kind of back to the dictator, or there's only, say, 2 different governing elites, then that level of tax revenue would lead to D star duration. But on our more competitive duration curve, where there's maybe lots of different governing elites who could come in and take over, if the governing elite decided to charge that level or get that level of tax revenue, they would actually have a much shorter stint, and roughly about half the amount of time in power. And so that's the only change really that's happened here, right? That's a move from that the increase in competition has just caused a shallower duration curve, meaning that every given level of tax revenue will mean a shorter duration, because there are other people who come in. Citizens will want, lower tax revenues. They want to see less and less political rent. But one thing that should be pointed out is, even with this increase in competition, the governing elite are still going away with a political rent, right? So we can see that with this new duration curve, the governing elite would choose level of tax revenue T, I think TD here, because that's going to mean that they are at point G, which maximizes their political rent, right? And we still get this area, TD minus C multiplied by D star. So we still have that area there, which is political rent, right? They're collecting more tax revenue than's required to actually pay for the public services. So what we'll see in a minute or two is how that can be made to disappear, right? And you can maybe think about it now already. What has to happen to this duration curve in order to get us to a place where there is no political rent? Well, we need to see more and more competition, right? So it's going to have to get shallower and shallower and shallower. And we'll talk about in a second where that's going to go. One thing just to use this diagram to talk about is how we can actually see a sort of income and substitution effect going on here. And I'll explain that. I'll talk through that in a second, again, just after a quick pause. Okay, so just one more thing to talk about with this diagram. And again, just drawing a link with some things that we have seen before and back, I think, way back in maybe unit 3, this idea of an income effect and a substitution effect. So it feels just a little bit strange to refer to them as an income and substitution effect here, because we're not really thinking about, I suppose, like choosing between 2 different goods, but we're using the same sort of idea, which is we've imagined that something has now changed, right? So going from the less competitive duration curve to the more competitive duration curve, it's gotten shallower, which means there's been a change in the sort of opportunity costs, right? A change in how much, say, a decrease in tax revenue, how much that will lead to an increase in the duration of the time in office, right? That trade-off has changed when we get from the less competitive to the more competitive situation. So we can try and break the change down into our income effect and substitution effect. So how do we get the income effect? Well, we actually imagine that the curve hasn't changed, the trade-off hasn't changed, and we see if it hadn't changed, then what would have to happen, or what would the kind of governing elite do to get themselves to the new ISO rent, this lower one? So what we do is shift the line parallel. So a parallel shift until it's a tangent to the new ISO rent curve, which I'm not sure I've done that absolutely brilliantly, but it's okay. So let's say it's like roughly here. So let's focus on the duration, right? So we can see if the trade-off hadn't changed, to get to this lower ISO rent curve, then we see what happens is that the governing elite decide to reduce the duration in office. And in fact, we also see that they reduce the tax revenue that they're charging, right? So from this TN here to some lower level, and they also reduce the duration. And so just to focus on the duration for now, I won't talk about the tax revenue part. That gap there, right, we could refer to as the income effect. Okay. And then the substitution effect, that is just the difference between where we would end up if the trade-off hadn't changed and where we actually end up. And we see where we actually end up when the trade-off is taken into account, and the new trade-off is taken into account is at point G. And so we actually end up back over here at point G. The duration kind of gets increased. So we see the substitution effect here is actually positive, that the governing elite kind of overall, the combination of the income effect and the substitution effect is to bring us to a place where the duration in office is still the same, all right? Still the actual same amount. That the income effect is kind of negative, like forget that part. It's the income effect is wanting to decrease the duration in office so that they could potentially achieve a higher tax revenue. But the substitution effect is kind of bringing us back over here, a lower tax revenue and a higher number of years, a higher duration in office. So that's just how we can try and like break down what's going on into an income and substitution effect. So to summarize, the income effect comes from taking the original feasible frontier, in this case, the original duration curve, and just shifting it until it's tangent to the new ISO rent curve. And then that like horizontal gap or the vertical gap gives us the income effect. And then to get the substitution effect, we just see, well, where do we have to go from here, this point here, to where we know we actually end up? And that's going to give us the substitution effect. So in this case, we see that the substitution effect kind of lowers the tax revenue even further to get us, and then causes an increase in the duration of years. So that's how we can break that down. Okay, so I think then we move on to the idea of democracy. Oh no, there is one more little bit here. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot about this bit, which is the possibility of an increase in competition actually leading to stability, right? So what story could we tell to kind of justify that? Well, you can imagine if there are more political parties and if voters know that they have, I say political parties, if there are more different options for governing elites, so maybe political parties, if there are more options, then maybe that means that people are a little bit more lenient, a little bit more tolerant. And so there's actually a greater amount of stability. It's less likely that people will, have like revolutions or uprisings. And so that is how we could get this kind of quite interesting new duration curve where it's gotten shallower, right? So we can see that it is shallower than this other one. But if we kind of follow it along, we see that now the maximum duration that a government could stay in power for is actually longer, right? We see there are certain tax revenues where so let's take, for example, right, this tax revenue here, that level here in this more competitive, or maybe let's actually take this level here. So we take that level of tax revenue, we can see in this more competitive environment that would lead to, this duration But in the old competitive environment, in the old less competitive environment, we'd actually get a longer duration. But if the tax revenue goes low enough, then actually in the more competitive environment, there's going to be more stability than a longer duration than in the less competitive environment. So it's possible that the increased competition also brings a level of stability that allows governments for certain tax revenues, even though there's more competition, to stay in power for longer. So that's a kind of possible alternative story that we could tell about how the duration curve might change. So I think now this is the last bit before we now go on to the idea of democracy and the median voter model. So, okay, now we're going from, we've had dictatorship, we've had a kind of governing elite, both of whom are able to get political rents. And now we move to democracy, and we start to imagine an ideal democracy where political rents are not possible. But before we talk about the model and the median voter model, let's just be really clear about what do we mean by democracy. And to start with, we talk about what does it mean in terms of it being a political institution, right? So political institutions, they are the rules of the game. Okay, so this is now us sort of starting to think about this, maybe using ideas from game theory, that political institutions of the country determine what the rules of the game are. They determine who has the power and how it's exercised. So democracy is a particular political institution where the rules, the set of rules determine who makes up the government and the powers that the people who are in government can actually use when they're governing, right? And then particularly, we think of a democracy as having three particular types of political institution. Okay, so the first is the rule of law, where everybody's bound by the same laws. We've got civil liberties, where every member of society, every citizen is guaranteed particular rights. And then we've got elections, and we've got elections that are inclusive, right, where very few people are excluded from voting. The elections are fair, where your vote gets counted, and they're decisive, as in when the election happens and say a new party gets the most votes, that they come into power. Right? There is actually a changeover of power. So those three institutions kind of determine or define like what we mean by democracy. So then, yeah, we start to think, well, let's build a simple model of what would happen if we have a democratic system, and a democratic system where there are only two political parties. And we can use this like simple model to imagine what would happen, right? So what we imagine is we have a whole spectrum of people in the country. Like the citizens have a whole spectrum of political positions going from left, so far left over here, to far right. And here's a really key assumption of this model. We assume that there is a kind of a uniform distribution of people along this spectrum, right? So there's no sort of collection of lots of people on the far left and very few people in the center and lots of people on the far right, or, you know, lots of people here in the center right, and then no far right people. We imagine a uniform distribution, so kind of equal numbers of people at every political position. So if you're the only political party, it doesn't matter where you pitch your ideas, right? Because if you're the only party, everybody votes for you, or maybe they abstain. But if a second political party comes along, well, then things get interesting, because both political parties now can think about, well, I want to try and maximize the number of votes I get, so I'm going to position my party along the spectrum to maximize my vote share. So we have A0, this is our sort of left party, and B0, our right party. Now, B0 or party B, actually I'll stop saying the numbers because that indicates a change of position. So B, party B, they're thinking, well, we want to win the election, so what are we going to do? Let's now position ourselves right next to party A, but just a little bit to the right. And so therefore, we're going to get everybody here, right? We're going to get everybody to the right of A0 and all the way to the far right, and we're going to win the election. But then person A sort of thinks, well, hold on a second. If they're going to do that, then what I should do is actually just leap over them and go a little bit further to the right? And that's what we see down here. Well, actually, not quite what we see down here, but we imagine that they've gone to A1, right? And party B is still here. And now, so party A are thinking, right, now we've got everybody from this position all the way over to the right. But obviously, party B will respond to that, and they'll now kind of flip and just go a little bit further to the right. And this will carry on and on and on, because they're both kind of thinking, if we can just get everybody a little bit further to the right than the other party, then we should be fine. But eventually, they're going to get to the middle, right? And once they get to the middle, this logic kind of doesn't work anymore, because say party A here, they don't want to jump a little bit further to the right, because then they'll actually get a less than 50% share. And that doesn't make sense. They're not going to win. And party B, they don't want to jump to the left or jump to the right, because again, same outcome, they'll have a less than 50% share. So where do they end up? They both end up in the middle, basically with the same political positions. And that's what this median voter model says, that if there are two political parties in a country, that what will happen when it comes to them trying to maximize their share of the votes is they will both just end up right in the center with basically identical policies. And you could argue that this is the case in quite a few countries, maybe less so in, I don't know, maybe the last 5 years, but go back to the 1990s, 2000s, early 2000s, and maybe you could argue that the Democrats, the Republicans in America, very similar policies. Certainly maybe the Conservatives and the Labour Party back then, very, very similar policies. So that is what this median voter model kind of tells us might happen in those circumstances. Now, one final kind of addition to it is, what if there are certain voters who just are not going to vote, right? They just don't want to. Well, what will that mean? Well, so we see on the diagram here, we've got this green section of people on the left who are just not going to vote. And so what that means is basically the same outcome as above will happen, except the parties will just keep on shifting to the right until they've got to a place where there are 50% of voters to the left, 50% to the right. So in this case, if people on the left say, oh, I'm not going to vote, well, we see that political parties are then forced to kind of shift their position far enough to the right that they both get a 50% share. So that illustrates a potential problem with people who, well, a problem, I'm not sure I should say a problem, but it illustrates what could happen if certain voters just abstain. So this median voter model definitely has some issues with it, some weaknesses. And let's kind of run through some of those now. So what are some of the problems with the median voter model? Well, we kind of saw one in that last example, which is not everybody votes, right? But the idea that maybe, it's only people on the far left to the far right, that's maybe not realistic. But in a country, not everybody votes. And so that's a little bit of a flaw in the argument. Then the whole model, this median voter model, the idea is to try and maximize your voter share, but that's not the only reason that people, choose a particular platform. They might actually believe in the particular platform. It's not just about trying to get as many votes as possible. They actually maybe have some principle to it, or a little bit more cynically, they are trying to get particular wealthy citizens to contribute financially, or they're trying to persuade people, activists, volunteers, to work for them, to work for the campaign. So that could be something that might influence their position. It's not just about maximizing voter share. Oh, and this is kind of what I was saying. The leaders of political parties, they might actually care. All right, they might actually be in politics to achieve particular goals, and they're not going to just adjust their platform, their sets of policies in order to maximize voter share. And then the big issue, voters are not evenly distributed along the political spectrum, right? That's, it says it's not like the beach, right? So that comes in the unit. It talks about, an ice cream sellers on the beach, because there's like an equal distribution of people along the beach. But the idea that that's true for voters, that there's an equal number of people along every position on the political spectrum from left to right, that's just not realistic. So that's what's going to encourage us to move from this median voter model. Although one thing I should just point out, just to make this game theory link, this position here, where both parties are in the center, is a Nash equilibrium, because neither player, neither party A or party B, wants to do anything different, right? They're both getting, at this point, 50% of the voter share, and a move either way will decrease that. So they wouldn't want to do that. So this is a Nash equilibrium. So moving on from the median voter model, we now have this idea of an ideal democracy. And I kind of hinted at this earlier on. An ideal democracy kind of brings us back to this previous model with our duration curve and our ISO rents. And what happens in an ideal democracy is it's not possible to achieve political rents. And so our duration curve actually keeps on getting shallower and shallower and shallower because there's so much competition. It gets so shallow that it becomes horizontal. Horizontal meaning that the tax revenue that's being collected is equal to the cost of the public services. So there is no political rent being collected. And that actually means that the duration a party could potentially spend in power is kind of infinite. And that's maybe a bit of a flaw with using this to represent or to think about an ideal democracy, because, well, here's the biggest problem, or the biggest simplification of this model. We're thinking of government as basically just deciding on what level of tax revenue to set, and not about other decisions that governments make. But that's what this table here kind of pointing out. We can make these links between the political model we've come up with and the economic model. So a dictator, very similar to a monopolist, right? That the monopolist charges a price higher than the marginal cost. The dictator collects tax revenue higher than the cost of public services. The dictator gets political rents. The monopolist gets economic profits, economic rents. Whereas an ideal democracy is like perfect competition, where in perfect competition, the demand curve for the firm is flat, right? It's completely horizontal, and they charge a price equal to marginal cost. They don't make any profit. And in ideal democracy, there's so much competition that whoever is in government has to collect tax revenue that's just enough to cover the cost of public services. So no political rent is actually earned. All right, so the final thing I'm going to talk about in the video is this idea of government failure. But I actually think I'm going to leave this for a short second, which, I'm going to leave this for a short second part. So I'm going to pause there for now, and there'll be a second part to the video where I go through that last bit.